All right. Good afternoon. It's a very great privilege to introduce Professor Galen McKinley from now at Columbia University with appointment at Lamont-Doherty Laboratory, and her expertise is atmosphere ocean physics. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And
Carbon cycle.
she got her degree at undergraduate degree in civil engineering at Rice University, PhD in climate physics and chemistry from MIT. From 2004 to 2017, she was professor of atmosphere and ocean sciences at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then after which time she joined Columbia and Lamont. She's very active in service activities, National Academy Ocean Studies Board, Climate and Global Dynamics Advisory Panel at NCAR. I hope that continues.
I do too, yes, we all do.
And on the Jason Advisory Group, which is a kind of hidden activity, but very important advisory to a number of cabinet departments. And she received the AGU Ocean Science Voyager Award for leadership in the scientific community. Her talk today is slightly different in title and from what was advertised, but I was sort of hoping that the subject would include enhanced marine carbon dioxide removal, and I could tie that into Earth Day. But we're talking now really the underlying science of ocean carbon uptake, theory, models, and Sparse data, you bet. So let us welcome Professor Galen McKinley.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks to Stephen for being my host. Yeah, I want to talk about ocean carbon uptake, which I think is a very appropriate topic for Earth Day, given that the ocean is the dominant sink for anthropogenic carbon, except for besides the atmosphere. So the basic kind of big picture idea of my talk here is that we have variable air-sea CO2 fluxes across the globe. This is a numerical model from the Echo-Darwin model out of JPL. Outgassing is blue, uptake outgassing is red, sorry, uptake is blue, and the vector winds are shown in gray. The sum of all these fluxes across the globe adds up to the most important sink term in the global carbon budget. This is a waterfall plot showing the sources of carbon integrated since 1850 to 2024 here, the most recent budget. Fossil fuels, 500 gigatons of carbon. Land use change, an updated number this year in the global carbon budget, about 250. The land sink, significantly smaller this year than last year by about 20%. And the ocean's substantially larger this year, now at 200 gigatons of carbon. What the ocean doesn't take up, remains in the atmosphere, right? And what the land sink contributes, the ocean sink contributes, and the remainder is what remains in the atmosphere. So this 200 gigatons is a really important modulating effect on the atmosphere. The atmospheric CO2 would be about 95 ppm higher right now if not for the ocean sink. And of course, the future of climate change really just to first order depends on this budget. You know, to first order, how much do we decide to emit and clear the land, and then how do these natural sinks respond? And in terms of ideas of carbon dioxide removal that Stephen mentioned, whether marine or land, right now, the total flux, the flux of carbon from fossil fuels to the atmosphere is about 10 petagrams of carbon per year. CDR right now adds up to a few mega tons of carbon per year, about 5 orders of magnitude smaller on the global sub than our emissions, right? So really, these sinks on the land, natural sinks in the land and the ocean are the ones that matter. And I would say most of the carbon dioxide removal that we're talking about right now is snake oil, and potentially on long time scales can have a small impact on the atmosphere, but the potential to really scale these technologies to petagram scale would be a scale-up effort unlike humans have ever undertaken on this planet. And it's very clear that mitigation of our emissions has got to be the first order priority. So I'm happy to talk more about CDR if you're interested, but we have to recognize that in every projection, in every estimate, the cutting of emissions is the first order task. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the ocean carbon sink. The ocean carbon sink really is part of a total carbon cycle in the ocean that combines a natural carbon cycle, which is much larger and very vigorous, and a relatively small perturbation due to the adding of CO2 to the atmosphere. So the total carbon in white is the sum of the natural and the anthropogenic in green, and the natural side includes the biological pump, the uptake of carbon by phytoplankton in the presence of sunlight, the relatively small percentage loss of that organic matter to the deep ocean, and the overturning circulation of the ocean that pulls the waters down and returns the high carbon waters enriched by this biological pump to the surface. So the natural gradient here from observations is certainly less at the surface and more at depth because of the biological pump, and the magnitude is in the order of 2,000 millimoles per meter cubed. The anthropogenic side has the opposite gradient, right? Because that's invading from the atmosphere. And the anthropogenic side is really Henry's law operating at the global scale. We're adding carbon to the headspace above the water, and we're driving it into the surface ocean. And then the overturning circulation is slowly pulling this perturbation down into the deep ocean. So the gradient is the opposite sign, and the magnitude is a couple orders of magnitude smaller than the natural. So really, when we're looking for this anthropogenic carbon sink, the one that was summed up on the previous slide, we are looking for a needle in the haystack of this natural carbon cycle, all this variability, and we're trying to identify how much additional carbon has gone into the ocean because of human activities. I'm happy to keep talking, but if you do have questions along the way, please raise your hand. I'm happy to make this interactive if you have questions. So this is a global mean perspective, and if we look spatially, the surface expression of the circulation and the biology of that natural carbon cycle is really setting the PCO2 of the ocean, the partial pressure of CO2 in the surface ocean. And you can see that there are some regions, let's see if this will work for me, some regions such as the equatorial Pacific where the PCO2 of the ocean is higher than the atmosphere. By this is an 88 to 2018 average, so the mean PCO2 would have been about 360. So here we have PCO2 in the ocean higher than the atmosphere. At the higher latitudes, we tend to have PCO2s lower than the atmosphere, and that then is reflected in the CO2 flux. So if you have a gradient that's positive to the atmosphere, you're fluxing out, and negative to the atmosphere, you're fluxing in. This pattern of PCO2 is really what sets the CO2 flux pattern. The flux is also impacted by the turbulence in the ocean, which is typically parameterized as a square function of wind speed. But what we're really interested in here is understanding how do we understand what this PCO2 field is, how is it evolving in space and time, and how is it responding to forcing. And really, again, looking for this needle in the haystack when we are trying to get an anthropogenic flux here on the order of 2 to 3 petagrams of carbon per year in the context of variability, and including things like a biological pump, which is rather poorly quantified, 5 to 10 petagrams of carbon per year. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. So how do we make progress on quantifying the magnitude of the sink? Well, there are 3 main ways that we do that in our current science. The first is to use interior observations and products derived from them So this is shipboard, high quality observation, so the ghost ship cruises, and we measure to the full depth of the ocean with high quality quantities such as the dissolved organic carbon in the ocean. This is a section through the Atlantic. And then with multiple sections like that, for example, in the decades of the 2000s, the decade of the 2010s, we can build up an integrated understanding and interpolate between these transects of the change in carbon content over these time periods. So these sections on the right-hand side are going south in the Atlantic, to the east through the Indian Ocean sector of the Southern Ocean, and then north through the Pacific. All right, so we have the Atlantic, the Southern Ocean sector, and the Pacific. Here, 94 to 04 estimated from this, and 04 to 14 estimated from this. And with the quantity plotted is the change, the decadal change in anthropogenic carbon in the ocean. And so you can see that the numbers here are on the order of 10 to 12 at the maximum, and the vertical is expanded in the surface ocean, so you can really see the thermocline. Most of the anthropogenic carbon absorbed by the ocean is in the upper ocean. As I said, it's a perturbation coming in from the surface, and mostly it's held in the bowls of the thermocline. Yes, yeah.
So just looking at the transect, it seems that it's pretty sparse. So how well mixed is the carbon in the ocean to make such an estimate?
Yeah, so
really quantitative.
There's a lot of interpolation that has gone on to fill in the gaps along the water masses of the connecting our estimates of water masses, for example, on this section and this section to fill in those gaps. There's modeling studies behind this to try to understand the uncertainties associated with that degree of extrapolation. But I'm going to talk about different sparse data primarily, but clearly this is sparse data, right? Now the benefit is the deep ocean, it's not mixing on timescales of a year, right? So we have very long timescales in the deep ocean. So if we sort of think that there's some sort of steady state-ish properties, but definitely this is a challenge. What are the real uncertainties, and how well can we really distinguish? For example, is this change here apparent of more anthropogenic carbon absorbed in the deeper thermocline of the Atlantic in this decade compared to this? Is that robust? I'm not sure that it is. I think it becomes more robust as we get more and more averaging, but the details are definitely going to also be a function of the interpolation that happens. Yeah. So, but still, we are doing these sections, we are getting these estimates, and one of the very interesting things that comes out of this work is that if we take the total oceanic anthropogenic carbon estimated at 0 in 1800, and then we look at these section-based estimates for 94, for the decade around 94, decade around 94 to 04. This is before 94, 94 to 04, and 04 to 14. You can see that those lines, those estimates lie very much along the same trajectory as the atmospheric CO2 concentration, with pretty small uncertainty bars, bigger in the first estimate. And this is really what I was saying before. This is Henry's law operating at the global scale. The ocean sink is basically following this very large perturbation of CO2. We're putting massive quantities in the atmosphere, and the ocean is sucking it up at the surface. And based on these high quality observations, yes, they're sparse, but we can fill in those gaps. So those are the interior estimates, and we get those decadally because it takes a decade to do this sampling, because we don't get that sampling every year. So we only have decadal estimates, not annual. But we want to have more spatial resolution so we can use models. Okay, so we can build numerical simulations of the ocean and estimate air sea fluxes, get mechanisms, make projections with models, which is important. And I'm sure most of you are aware of what a model is, but we take a circulation of the ocean, put the equations on a discretized grid, add carbon processes, run it on a big computer, and you get some CO2 fluxes out of that, right? Certainly, no model is perfect, but many can be useful, but they are a main way we make these estimates. We are using observed surface ocean PCO2, which is extremely sparse, as I'll get into more, based on volunteer ships, research ships, container ships, a whole set of observation platforms, some moored systems as well. And then we use machine learning to fill in the gaps and estimate the PCO2 field and then the CO2 flux. So that looks like this. So the SOCAT PCO2 database, which is a modern evolution of the database that Taro Takahashi at Lamont first started to put together, 57 to actually goes through 2004 now. And this is all the data, but this is like 1 month of data. So it is, at 1 by 1 degree, we have a 2% coverage of the global ocean, excluding the Arctic and the marginal seas. So this is a very sparse data set, and so we clearly can't just interpolate this and kind of smush it out everywhere. So what we do is we use machine learning. We train the PCO2, we train algorithms based on co-located temperature, salinity, mixed layer depth, chlorophyll, and then we use full field variables, full field estimates of these variables, such as from satellite, to estimate the PCO2 field at all points. From that, we can calculate the flux, and then we have our full field estimate that we can compare to the models to the interior estimates. So, all of these methods are imperfect, but one of the amazing things is that they kind of agree. This is a global flux time series. Green are the models, blue are the products, orange are those interior estimates. And, given the uncertainties, given the sparsity of the data, given the imperfection of our models, the degree of agreement is pretty surprising, right? And we have 1 sigma spread across these different sets. The total spread at the end is about 0.7 petagrams of carbon per year by these numbers. That varies year to year a bit. But, one of the things one might ask is, how is it possible that all of these results agree to this degree, and what does it mean about our understanding about the underlying processes?
Before you go on, can
Yeah.
you remind me again what interior is?
The interior are the decadal sections, the hydrographic sections, and estimates of the anthropogenic component there. Yeah. So interior, while the products are based on just surface ocean PCO2.
And just to remind everybody, a negative number means flux into the ocean.
Yeah, it's a growing sink as shown by the brown arrow over here. This is an uptake by the ocean. Okay, so the outline, what I want to talk to you today about is thinking about the force drivers for the ocean carbon sink that really allow us to explain most of the variability shown in that time series. And so this is why I make the case that if really the ocean carbon sink was kind of just a science question, we wanted to understand the basic mechanisms, maybe we would be kind of done with those questions right now. But the reason we need to continue to work this problem is because climate policy is going to require reduced carbon sink uncertainties. We need to manage the carbon cycle in order to manage the climate, and for that, plus or minus 0.7 petagrams of carbon per year is insufficient level of certainty. And we also need better spatial disaggregation. So I'm going to use ocean models to test these machine learning-based PCO2 reconstructions. The data is really sparse, 2% coverage. How well can we do? And I will show you that we can capture some of the basic features of the ocean's PCO2 field based on these tests. And then we're going to try to build some better reconstructions by actually combining models with data using machine learning. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is how we can use these same fields, these same kind of approaches to identify gaps in our observing state, our observing system of PCO2, and to tell you about a new program that we're just starting where we're going to fill some of these gaps using autonomous platforms. Okay, so the first question, surface and interior data are so sparse and the models are really coarse, right? But how can these estimates agree so well? And my hypothesis is the very strong forcing from this rapidly rising atmospheric PCO2 and the effect of large volcanoes such as Pinatubo are sufficient to explain most of the variability in the ocean carbon sink when we talk about that global mean. And I'm going to test this using an extremely simple abiotic box model for the anthropogenic CO2 sink. So in this model, my global upper ocean is represented as a single box. I have air-sea flux responding to the atmospheric PCO2, and I have an overturning circulation at a constant rate. I have these two terms where I'm bringing up abiotic DIC, so I've removed the effect of the biological pump, this overturning rate, and then I have air-sea CO2 exchange. So the atmospheric PCO2 is a key forcing, and I'm going to start by simply forcing my model with the observed variable growth rate of atmospheric CO2 and its variability. So here I take this simple box model, I force it with the global PCO2 time series, and I get this kind of variability here in the sink. These are anomalies. And I'm not showing you this quite yet, but I will. That this looks pretty good for part of the time series, but it's missing these big anomalies of additional uptake that happened in the early 80s and in the early 90s. And that gap can actually be filled by thinking about the fact that the temperature of the ocean modulates the relationship of PCO2 to DIC via solubility. So if the ocean got colder, you would expect the ocean PCO2 to go down, and you would expect more sink in the ocean. And lo and behold, we had these volcanoes, El Chichon and Pinatubo, that went off and did lower surface ocean temperature, SSTs, by about 0.1 with El Chichon and 0.2 with Pinatubo. So if I add that very simple time series to my model, I do get these uptake anomalies occurring at these points that I told you before was missing. And if I now plot those observationally based products and models on here, you can see that there's a very high degree of agreement of this extremely simple box model with the mean of these hindcast models shown in green, and also with the products. The correlations here, even after I take out the trend, are greater than 0.9. So this tells us that the basic mechanism driving the variability and long-term trend in the ocean carbon sink is the rising atmospheric CO2 and the variability in that growth rate, plus these perturbations due to large climatically relevant volcanoes. All right? So the fact that these processes are represented in our hindcast models, the fact that the observationally based products are able to capture those relationships and then express them in the machine learning products is basically why we get this large degree of agreement.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, and I'm asking mostly because I don't understand this, not because I know. The mixing rate in the atmosphere for carbon dioxide is really much, much, much faster than
Yes.
the ocean.
Yes.
How do you reconcile that? Because the dip, they seem to be like going almost at the same time.
Because the cooling of because I mean in this box model or in the real world, the cooling of due to the volcano like Pinatubo is quite global. It's a little bit more northern hemisphere than southern hemisphere, but there's a large scale cooling effect, and you basically, for the same carbon content, cooler water is able to. The PCO2 goes down, right? It's very straightforward. So you cool the water for the same carbon content, you drop the PCO2, and now you're able to flux more in. So it's really just a solubility argument there. Yeah. And we did do some additional studies on the issue of Pinatubo using the CSM large ensemble. That's a paper published in 23. And then we've also done similar tests with the Echo-Darwin model published in 24. So the effect of El Chichon and Pinatubo is not actually globally, totally uniform, but it is large and does have a global effect. But it is a bit more northern hemisphere amplified in our best estimates. Okay, so the core drivers of the global ocean carbon sink and its variability are known, are well established by this work and other. But we need more precision to support climate policy. So as you're probably aware, every year the global carbon budget comes out. That this is the most recent one where we have the sources, a fossil, land use source in brown here, the sink in the ocean, the sink in the land, and the remainder in the atmosphere. The plot I showed you on the first slide of the talk is just the cumulative sum of these reservoirs. And the global carbon budget is released before the COP negotiations every year. Is the main way that humanity is actually tracking our global response to something like climate change. Really, is by asking questions of how much did we emit and how much remained in the atmosphere. This is really the way it's done. But this is also an annual mean number for 5 different components that comes out every year, right? It's not spatially disaggregated, and still there's a lot of variability here that we don't understand. So there's a lot of work to be done because of the policy relevance. So that's the first conclusion. The fundamental drivers of the sink are pretty much understood, but we need reduced uncertainty for climate policy. Okay, so how do we use then machine learning to map PCO2 from the sparse data, as I mentioned before? So we take these data, we make an algorithm at the points where we have PCO2, and then we run the algorithm, plugging in full field variables, and so we can make an estimate of PCO2 at all the points and estimate the flux. But as you're probably asking yourself, giving this very, very sparse input data, 2%, how reliable can these products be, right? And how are we really going to know, given that we've never actually observed PCO2, large sections of the South Pacific, for example? How would we know that? Well, we can take some of the lead from the atmospheric science community, and we can use simulation as a test bed. So in this case, we're going to take Earth system models that do give us a full coverage PCO2 field and use them as a test bed to evaluate the potential skill of these machine learning based algorithms. So what we do is we take 100 different members from 4 Earth system models. We sample them like the observations using the same mask as used in the real world. We train, test, and evaluate our machine learning. We've done this with neural networks. We've done this with random forest and XGBoost, all different kinds of algorithms, from different groups. We make our algorithms, and then we reconstruct for each of the members. And then in a test bed, we have this step 4 that we will never have in the real world, where we can statistically compare the reconstructed flux to the model truths. And we can do that at each point in space and time. Because we know the truth. We will never know the true ocean PCO2 field in September of 2025 at all points in space, but we can get it from our model. So then, as I said, we can take each ensemble member, we can break down the full signal and look at trends, seasonality, variability, and we can say how well is our reconstruction able to replicate that. So to begin with bias, if I look at this particular neural network and I do this 100 times with 100 different members from the CMIP5 in this case, I find that the global mean bias is basically 0 if I average over these 30 years. But there are large regions, particularly in the southern hemisphere, where the data are particularly sparse, where there are large regions of bias that then are canceling out to get to this global mean 0 bias, okay? So at every 1 by 1 point, I don't get a perfect result, but at the large scale, I do get a pretty good estimate. I can look at seasonality. I can ask the question, how well correlated is my reconstruction with the actual truth? And for the seasonality, my correlations tend to be higher than 0.8. So these machine learning based methods are pretty good at capturing the seasonal cycle, but they are not as good at getting the decadal phasing, the phasing of decadal variability, which is really not surprising. Again, 2% coverage of the global ocean, it's maybe a little surprising that we can get the seasonality at all, but it seems like we can do a reasonable job, but the decadal variability is just even more poorly sampled. So it's not totally surprising. And then if we look at the standard deviation of the percent error to capture the amplitude of the seasonality, we find that overall we slightly overestimate the amplitude of the seasonality, but for most of the regions, including the southern hemisphere, we're within about 10% of the seasonal amplitude for the seasonal amplitude. But for the decadal, it is not such a good story. In the Southern Ocean in particular, we get a potential for a very significant overestimation of the amplitude of the seasonality, of the decadal variability, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. And globally, that leads to about a 21% overestimate of the variability, all right? So this test bed approach, which we published first in 21 and have been using now subsequently in various ways, gives us a platform to evaluate these reconstruction approaches in the context of the sparse sampling, right? This analysis suggests that the machine learning applied to sparse surface ocean data can constrain the long-term mean and seasonality, at least for large regions of the ocean. But certainly at the 1-by-1 scale, there remains a lot to be desired. So now we're going to say, how can we do better? Can we do better in terms of these products than shown in this first study? And the aim we're going to do there is we're going to say, well, what if we took the skill of what we have for the models and their potential skill, and we actually use machine learning to combine that with the observations? So here we're going to use an XGBoost algorithm, and instead of calculating the actual PCO2, we're going to calculate a model data misfit. We're going to learn a model data misfit at all points in space, add those misfits back to the model, and use that to estimate our PCO2 field. So essentially, we're using simulations, in this case, hindcast models of the global ocean. We're using those as a first guess, and then we're correcting them with the observations. And I'm going to show you how we build up this dark blue line, LDO, HPD, our contribution to the global carbon budget. So first thing is we have to calculate full field model data misfits. We only have data at 2% coverage, but we can estimate where the model is off at all points in space using the machine learning. And so here are just two models. Here's JJA and DJF. And you can see that the misfits in these models are quite different seasonally and between the different models. So for example, DJF in Princeton suggests that the model is way overestimating PCO2, while for CNRM it suggests it's way underestimating PCO2. And these values are plus or minus 100 microatmospheres, which are massive compared to the global mean delta PCO2 of about 10 microatmospheres. So large misfits, very different for each model. It does tell us something about what the models are doing wrong. I'm not going to talk about that here, but I'm happy to talk more about that. So if we take these misfits, apply them back to the models, and then average to get the PCO2, we can get this dark blue line correcting the models with these corrected fields. And so the original models are shown in gray in the back. Other products that were available when we first published this paper shown in green, and our estimate is shown in dark blue. So let's ask the question, how well do these this product and other products do compared to some independent data from the hydrography, from GLODAP? This is a Taylor diagram here, where I have the standard deviation on the vertical axis and the horizontal axis, and then the correlation is around here. This is the standard deviation of the data sitting at 36, and 1 would be a perfect correlation. So ideally, all of your products and your models would sit down here on the star, and they would be perfectly aligned with the observations where you have them. But the reality is we find that our global ocean models sit up here, slightly more variability, more standard deviation at the observed points, correlations, maybe 0.6 on average. And the observation-based products tend to be higher correlation, closer to the observations, and closer in terms of that standard deviation. With LDO-HPD sitting here, the closest to GLODAP compared to the others, but only modestly so. Okay, so where does that enhanced skill arise? How do we get from these global ocean models to this HPD, right? What part of our correction, remember we've applied a correction to get here, what part of our correction is doing that? And as I'll show you, it turns out to be the climatological correction is the dominant part that moves us from up there on the Taylor diagram down to where we end up. So the climatological misfits that I showed you before here for the Princeton model, these are the 4 months of them. As I said before, 100 to negative 100 is the full spread there, so a big spread. If we look at the standard deviation of the interannual misfits, so just remove the climatology, what remains? You can see that in most of the ocean, the interannual misfits are less than 5 microatmospheres. So the data is suggesting that there's not a lot of correction beyond that climatological. This is not exactly the case in the equatorial Pacific, as you might expect, given ENSO, and to some degree at the very high latitudes. But mostly the climatology is the biggest signal in these misfits. All right, so how we're going to test the impact of the climatology by simply creating a different version of our product that doesn't use the interannual misfits, but only uses the climatological misfits. So what if we don't add the interannual correction, only add the climatology? That looks like this. The dashed line here with a cyan here. You can see that it definitely gets the same pattern of variability, but slightly more muted, as you might expect. But what I think is really telling is if I look at the Taylor diagram, we see that most of the movement from here to here occurs with the climatological misfit applied. And there's only a very small additional improvement towards the GLODAP data that would occur with the remaining interannual misfit applied. And so the climatological correction really is why we move, basically the models are wrong in the climatology compared to the data, and we're able to correct that with machine learning. So the nice thing about this is also that it gives us an approach to correct our models prior to the existence of observations. So since the model's correction provides most of this additional skill, we can then use it to correct the models in the pre-observed period. Okay, so our final product is going to use the interannual misfits after 82 and the climatological misfits from 2000 to 2020 in the 2000 to present, whatever that is, in the prior period, okay? So this is going to lead to a product that probably underestimates the variability early on, but still it gives us a reasonable way to make an estimate back to 59, which is the beginning of the global carbon budget. So this is our climatological correction, or annually varying correction, and we have a product that's used annually in the global carbon budget, monthly, one by one, that goes back to 1959. So this, I think in terms of getting to better skill in our estimates of the ocean of the CO2 sink, what's really important is that we do things like compare to observations as shown here and demonstrate improved skill. Of course, these data are quite sparse as well, so we need more independent data. But we can clearly see that our models are not as good as our product based on these comparisons and others that I'm happy to talk about with you if you'd like. Okay, so correcting hindcast models with the sparse data really improves our estimates of the PCO2 field and the CO2 sink and allows for estimation from 59 to present. So the last question I want to get at is how can we best improve these products, right? They have skill, but as I showed you before, there are some real issues, for example, revealed here with an inability to adequately capture decadal variability in the Southern Ocean carbon sink. And there's still certainly remaining errors in the seasonality, in the decadal phasing, as well as these bias estimates here. What do we most need to do? Well, one of the great things about the testbed approach that we have been using is that we can now add to this testbed new observations, okay? So while in our standard approach, we're only going to sample the model as the SOCAT actual observations occurred, we can also go into our testbed and say, well, what if we had more data down here in the Southern Ocean? What if Argo floats were able to give us high quality PCO2 estimates at many points in space? How would that improve our algorithms, right? So we can use the testbed for what some people call an observing system simulation experiment and OSSI, and ask the question, where can we get the most bang for our buck by filling in gaps? So we've done quite a bit of work here on this. One of them is with Argo. So Argo is, of course, taking temperature and salinity measurements in the global ocean, but in recent years has also been outfitted with pH sensors with the hope of getting PCO2 estimates from those pH combined with alkalinity based on salinity. The challenge is that there's a long chain between PCO2 observations to get to pH observations to get to PCO2, and we know that those have pretty large random errors, and there's significant concern that those PCO2 data may be biased. So we asked in this study, well, what if we took our SOCAT data, we added Argo in two different patterns, the pattern doesn't really matter, and we said, what if that Argo had no error on it, it was perfect, the data, what if it had random error, plus or minus 11 microatmospheres, and what if it had a bias of plus 4 microatmospheres, which has been estimated by various studies. And then here we have a time series of the bias in the global reconstruction when we added Argo to the system since the year 2000, okay? So we have black is without any Argo, and then the blues are with the biased Argo, and the greens with no error, and the pink with some error. And what we learn from this is, the first thing we learn is that if we add biased Argo in blue, we do not help ourselves. We immediately increase our bias, and it's quite a strong response. Even though Argo is not so many points, but it's bringing in data, for example, in the winter Southern Ocean that we don't have, and the algorithm just says, great, I will learn that the PCO2 was 4 microatmospheres higher than it actually was. And the algorithm is very happy to jump to that solution. It doesn't know the difference. But if we add to the algorithm either with no error or with random error, it really doesn't matter if it has the random error or no error. The algorithms are basically designed to deal with the random error. It just learns the midpoint there, as long as it's truly random. So this is really important input to the people who are working on the Argo data, to tell them, you have to give us unbiased data. If we did have that unbiased data, we would do very well in our algorithms. We really hope to get it, but it cannot be biased, or we're going to get the wrong answer. The other, so I just added that, even with random error, we get a good global reconstruction. The other thing we can do is add more targeted observations. So in this study, we use our test bed again, and this is the absolute bias 2018 to 2022 air CO2 flux. If we only add the SOCAT sampling shown in the gray here, you can see these large splotches of large bias happening, particularly in the Southern Ocean. So with the ship sampling, and this is one of many studies that has shown the Southern Ocean is really is an area of particular bias, particular uncertainty, because the 70% of all the data is north of the equator, and there's very little data in the Southern Ocean, particularly in winter. So in this study, we added sail drone tracks using a zigzag pattern north of 55 south because of operational constraints that would prevent something like a sail drone from going south of 55 south. And we added this, basically 20 circumnavigations over 5 years. So 4 sail drones over 5 years and focused in winter. And if we do that, we see that we don't get rid of all of the bias, but we really get rid of most of it. We can really reduce the uncertainty. And it actually cuts the global sync uncertainty by about 25% by doing this. And we used these simulations to motivate a proposal to Schmidt Sciences that's been funded. And we're now starting a project called Constraining Ocean Carbon with Optimized Observing, or COCO2, which for 26 to 2030, we are going to do wintertime surface PCO2 observing missions with sail drone, informed by these kinds of OSSI studies. We're going to take wintertime data, which is a unique thing that sail drone can do. Sail drone has gone through hurricanes. Sail drone has already circumnavigated Antarctica. The data is going to be publicly available in the SOCAT database, so anybody using it to reconstruct the CO2 fluxes for the global carbon budget will be able to use it. And we are projected to reduce the ocean CO2 sink uncertainty by 25% by taking these data. We thank Schmidt Sciences, funded by Eric and Wendy Schmidt, for the significant funding required to make this happen, because the sail drone is a private company, and will be, a lot of this is really, they're funding these amazing observations. So thank you to Schmidt Sciences for that. And this is led by myself and Adrienne Sutton of NOAA, PNEL, and we have collaborators in Australia and South Africa who are doing key part of the work. So the conclusions then, I'll wrap up here. The fundamental drivers of the ocean sink for anthropogenic climate or carbon are really well understood, but we really need reduced uncertainty to try to drive climate policy, try to support climate policy, diagnosis of the global carbon budget. And so we're using machine learning with the sparse data to constrain the long-term mean and seasonality of the carbon sink. I think we can do that pretty well already. We can do good work by taking high gas models as priors and correcting those to the sparse data, and get our estimates back to 59 with these approaches. But we still know that the Southern Ocean winter PCO2 data are really scarce and most needed, and luckily we're going to have COCO2 coming in for the next few years collecting some of those winter data in 26 to 2030. So that is my presentation. I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. That was very nice on a number of levels and very informative. What specific instrument are you using to measure PCO2 on the CO2?
It's ASV CO2, which is a derivative of the MAP CO2 system developed at PNEL that's used on moorings. High quality data with gas calibration.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So back to the decadal variability.
Yeah.
Most probably, I would like to know your opinion, but I think you can't quite correct that because it's only 30 years, and for decadal you have only 3 samples.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you go around that problem?
So for example, with the, we're working on an analysis of this product right now that we're going to be submitting pretty soon, where what we could show is that the models actually have a decadal variability in them, right? So these are high gas models, and so they get in. So for example, they get some representation of what's going on in the Southern Ocean, and a lot of what the data are doing are, as I said, correcting the climatology of the PCO2 field. So I think by combining what the models can give us, imperfectly, but some signals of decadal variability driven by hindcast winds, really reanalysis winds, combined with a correction to the mean state of the models, we allow a lot of this to kind of organize itself into signals of decadal variability that we can capture. And we actually are finding in that paper that I'm not talking about here, a lot of coherent variability between the equatorial Pacific and the Southern Ocean in terms of the CO2 flux patterns, driving kind of less uptake in the 60s to 70s, more uptake in the 80s to 90s, and then less uptake. So, yeah, sort of a combined Pacific decadal mode driving the flux variability. Yeah.
Any questions from the back of the room? Students, postdocs?
Another question.
Go ahead.
Got one over here. Yeah.
No, no.
Am I on? Your last slide actually would address part of my questions.
The last slide with the pictures, this
Which
one?
is the thank you slide.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
So you talk about fluxes.
Yes.
You focused on PCO2.
I did, yes.
And the other component of those flux equations is the piston velocity, or whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
And that slide shows some of the complexity of that issue, and I'm wondering how you translate the PCO2 so confidently into a flux, given these kinds of conditions that you have that are quite variable, driving exchange processes.
Yeah, so I mean, so we're using the parameterization from Wanikoff 92 updated 2014, where the square function of the wind is the standard parameterization that is used for our products. People have used others. The global mean results aren't really that different if you use other flux estimates. Clearly, there's a lot more to be done, but all the studies that have, something like adding bubbles, for example, in your parameterization, that affects oxygen quite a bit, but it doesn't affect the CO2 at the global mean terribly much. It probably affects the distribution of the CO2 to some degree, and so I do think that improving our gas flux parameterizations is important. But all the evidence we have is that, about if we do like kind of uncertainty budgets of how do we get from PCO2 to flux, at least 2/3 of the uncertainty is in the PCO2, and maybe 1/3 is in the RC flux, right? So it's not nothing, but it's certainly not the dominant driver of our uncertainty. So yes, I am focused on PCO2 because it's the dominant mode, but I do agree that the RC flux is something that we have to work on, but I think that in part because of this, part of the challenge that we have in our field really is that this model works so well, okay? The fact that we are forcing the ocean so strongly with the atmospheric PCO2, we've gone up 50% since the pre-industrial, right? Means that a lot of the underlying errors get hidden by the fact that we're just forcing the thing so strongly, and then we take a global mean of it all, right? In anyone, but locally, for example, if you want to do marine carbon dioxide removal, I want a better gas exchange parameterization than Wanikoff for sure. But a lot of those errors get sort of averaged out by this massive forcing, and the fact that I can represent the sink with this very simple box model just tells you that like some of the details don't matter if you're forcing it so strongly and then you're taking the global mean. But I do think it matters locally, absolutely.
Yeah, following up on Bob's question, I suspect you're using reanalysis winds to get the wind speed to put into that
That's right.
Factor in that product, U squared times delta P. And if I understand it correctly, at least based on previous work, it's monthly means of both quantities. Is that accurate?
Well, we take the variance in order to calculate the flux, so we deal with the fact that the square of hourly winds is not the same as the square of monthly winds.
You bet. And
that is definitely taken into account, yes.
And there's an anti-correlation between the wind speed and the delta PCO2, because the faster the wind stirs it up, the greater the mixing and the lower the delta PCO2. So I'm wondering to what extent that gets folded into your considerations?
I think in a numerical model, where you would have a reactivity of the surface ocean to the variable, if you flux more carbon in time step 1, there's less of a delta for the next flux. Definitely those feedbacks are in there. They're not so much in there for the products, so I do think that there's some interpretation that can be has to be done carefully there. But yeah, we are estimating a monthly mean PCO2 field and using the winds that are available to us to make the flux estimate.
You say the next step. The next step should be an hour later and not a month later.
Yeah, well, we are we don't
That's
have the
a
resolution.
limitation. We don't have that information.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but we're estimating a mean PCO2 field to try to cover that gap. Yeah.
It's a challenge. It's a real challenge, and somebody has to step up to that challenge. And I'm so happy that you're doing it. Other questions? Lynn. Okay.
Hi, great talk. You said the model is abiotic. I'm curious if any of the parameterizations or the constants in your model are representative of biological processes, and also if you've investigated the difference between your model and observations in the context of what could be attributed to biology.
So there are multiple models that I've discussed here, right? So if we're thinking about a 3D, time-evolving ocean high-gas model, we are definitely going to have to include the biological pump in those models, right? But our understanding, for lack of observations to the contrary, is that the biological pump is an absolutely critical part of the natural carbon cycle and a large-scale pattern of PCO2. But it is not engaged in the anthropogenic carbon sink, okay? The biological pump is a background process when we think about the global integral, right? Because we know in the Holocene, right? We know for the Holocene that the atmosphere was basically constant, right? Let me find that slide, right? So we know that the atmosphere is basically constant back through the Holocene, right? Suggesting that even though the equatorial Pacific was outgassing, 80 petagrams of carbon, or total outgassing 80 petagrams, total uptake 80 petagrams, right? That all those processes were happening, right? But yet the atmosphere wasn't going up or down, so it's more or less flat, right? In the pre-industrial, and basically what our conceptual model that fits with all of these approaches that I've shown you, the three different approaches that I mentioned here, is that we basically have a background ocean carbon sink that continues to operate. The natural sink continues to go around, and we're adding this perturbation on top, right? Now, that said, if we think about the future, if the biological pump changes significantly, it absolutely has the potential to change how much carbon the ocean holds, right? But to date, we do not have observations that suggest that process is already ongoing. We don't have enough observations of the biological pump, really, obviously, and one can think of many reasons why it might be changing, but really, all of these estimates make the assumption, some explicitly, some implicitly, that the biological pump is in a long-term steady state. Okay? So this approach explicitly takes out biological change by using ALU and oxygen and other things, explicitly removing the effects from biology from the result. Because the carbon, this is DIC, not anthropogenic DIC, we are estimating how much of this carbon is just due to anthropogenic activities. So we explicitly take out biology here. Here we run our models to a steady state, globally average them, so those effluxes and influxes come out. In this, we're actually looking at the real PCO2 field, and there's less direct assumptions about biology, but the result all does turn out that you didn't need to invoke some big biological change in order to get these numbers to more or less agree, right? So yeah, and that's why my theoretical model, my extremely simple model, is an abiotic model, and it can get the same pattern, right? So I think that in terms of the biological pump and the carbon cycle, I think it is not true to say that the biological pump is important to today's anthropogenic carbon sink, but it has great potential for the future to be important. And that's why I think we desperately need better constraints on it.
I think one last question from Lamont.
Yes, hopefully this will be quick. Do you know whether there are efforts to use the global ocean model with biogeochemistry to assimilate currently available data, therefore to produce this flux?
Yeah, so there are. So actually this model that we have in this model here, the Echo-Darwin model, the ASCII-BGC model in this case, this is a data assimilation model that we're running and publishing in my group right now. So this is ecophysics. We use a Green's function approach to set the initial conditions and some of the parameters of the biological model here. So we are publishing this. And there's also the ECHO, the long-standing physical oceanography project also has a Darwin approach where they're doing a similar approach. Yeah, the challenge is that, for biology and carbon, but particularly for biology, we don't have major strokes that we can constrain very well. The equations are unknown, right? And we have a lot of data for the physics, right? Clearly not enough. It's still super under constrained, right? And echo, if you don't have data to say that there should be a boundary current right there, the solution variable might not put one there, right? But if you add the data to say that there should be a boundary condition, it'll come in. Well, for biology and biochemistry, it is 1,000 times worse, right? Because we don't have very good equations, right? We don't know what the equation structure should be. And we have at least an order of magnitude, not 2 orders of magnitude, fewer data points, right? So it's so much more nonlinear, it's so much more fully constrained. So I don't know if, I'm not convinced after going through a 6-year project to build this model that we're in a place where we can really do that data assimilation, really convincingly, based on the current tools. I mean, people are working on it with emulators and other things, but we don't know the equations of biology. We don't have the data. So are you really going to get a great answer in that case? I don't know. So yeah.
Okay. Just a quick response to what Flynn asked earlier. I think, my understanding at least, is that the biology is not subject to CO2 fertilization. It's nutrient limited. And therefore you're not going to expect the anthro impact in such a way as you're expecting it, you're tending to see it in the terrestrial biosphere. But I let the speaker have the last word on that.
Yeah, like I said, we don't have any evidence. That's why we drew this plot just like this, right? The biological pump is not included over here. We do not have evidence. We do not have evidence that there are trends in the ocean biological productivity at the large scale. We don't have satellites for long enough to see them, right? And lots of evidence suggests that you would need satellites, consistent records for at least 30 years to be able to see trends. Of course, people publish papers here and there that say they've seen a trend, but really those time series are too short, right? So we don't have evidence that the biological pump has changed. If it did, and it really is 5 to 10 petagrams, obviously a 10% change could have a big effect on how much carbon is in the ocean. But, we don't have that evidence, right? So, we don't have ideas that there's ocean acidification, which is part of this process, may negatively affect some biological species for sure. Don't totally know exactly how that works and how that integrates up. But yeah, no, from the carbon cycle perspective, the biological pump is still reasonably assumed to be in a long-term steady state.
Okay, let's give Galen an enthusiasm.